Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Victorian METS Export Hub Insights into METS series. And today, delighted to have you all here for a webinar entitled Africa Rising. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Grant Philpotts, who's going to do the introductions for today. Grant, all yours.
Thank you very much, Collins. Good afternoon and welcome to Austmine's Victorian METS Export Hub webinar called Africa Rising. I'm Grant Philpotts. I'm the membership manager here in Victoria and Tasmania for Austmine, and I'm also helping Collins out, who's our export hub lead on the Vic METS Export Hub. We've got a great lineup of speakers today. So this webinar is going to give you some insights into business in Africa and also mining in Africa. After the presentation concludes, we will have a Q&A session. So please use your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to put your questions in there. If they don't get answered today, we'll attempt to answer them over the course of the coming days and weeks and get back to you with those questions themselves. So Collins Rex, who's our Export Hub lead, is an international business specialist and will examine doing business in Africa, particularly considering the implementation of the recent African Continental Free Trade Area. Linton Cesari is co-founder and CEO of Rentstar Commodities and will update us on his copper projects in Zambia and Zimbabwe with a special emphasis on ESG. And just for everyone who's wondering, Linton is actually in Zambia at the moment as well, so I'm sure his internet will be strong enough. We've spoken to the people and we're organised that, so that should be going on first. So we'll just start off with Collins. So Collins is going to start. So if you've got any comments or questions, please put them in the Q&A blocks below. So over to you, Collins.
Thanks very much, Grant. And yes, cruel and unusual punishment for Linton, which, you know, we do what we have to do for the sake of our art, I guess. And as Grant mentioned, I am Collins Rex, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, which for me is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islanders peoples who may be joining us on today's webinar. So let's look at Africa, shall we? Just a little continent of 54 nations. And if we look at some of those key statistics for Africa, when you're thinking of why and how to do business on the continent, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are located in Africa. The continent is home to 1.3 billion people. The continent's collective nominal GDP was $2.2 trillion US in 2019. Africa has 10% of the world's oil reserves, 40% of its gold ore, and 80 to 90% of its chromium and platinum group metals. The rate of return on investment in Africa is higher than it is in any other developing region. And Africa also has the world's fastest growing population, and very importantly, its most youthful, with a substantial percentage of the population being under the age of 20. And of course, that has some amazing implications for staffing, for skills, etc. So it's a really great place to find the workforce of the future too. When you are thinking of doing business in Africa, there are a few things to take into account. So first of all, the African continent does comprise 54 independent countries. Each of those countries has its own demographics, its own language, its own culture, and of course, it also presents its own opportunities and challenges. And those challenges include rules, regulations, laws, business requirements, barriers to entry. You really cannot look at Africa as a whole. You have to pick your battle and choose the market that is most suitable to you and your product and your service, to your opportunities and the ones on which you can capitalize, and you need to do the relevant research. So before you choose where to invest in Africa, pick the right market. And this is not based on just how many people might be in that market or what the nominal GDP is in that market, but the market that is right for you. Which of your products and services can you sell in that market? What are the opportunities, but also what are the challenges? What are your resources and how many of those resources can you devote to expanding into that market? And what is your risk appetite? Markets with the greatest risks also very often have the highest returns on investments. So it's a bit of a trade-off. And of course, when in doubt, and we are actually able to say and do this now, visit the market and see for yourself. I would also suggest that if you are going to tackle any country within the African continent, you need to get expert advice. And indeed, you should probably do that irrespective of the market in which you tend to have your next foray, whether it be in Africa or anywhere else. In terms of Africa, the countries that were British colonies do tend to offer the easiest entry points because English is a common language and there are other commonalities with Australia, including commonalities, even though they will be not the same, but they are commonalities in the legal and the business systems. Of course, conversely, these are the countries that also tend to be more developed, which means they have lower growth rates and sometimes fewer opportunities. Again, we have that risk versus opportunity equation. So, for example, South Africa is very often perceived as an easy avenue into the continent, but it's not necessarily the best option, and certainly it isn't the best option for everyone. So really do look at your markets in their entirety and then consider the broader parameters, including political, economic, social, market trends, and any number of others before you decide your entry point. It's also very important that you pick the right market entry strategy. In some cases, you might need to set up an office in that market. You might not be allowed to operate in any other way. In some cases, the business structure that you have identified might not be available in that market rather. You might also not want to set up an office initially. Perhaps you just want to sell into the market, but what does that look like? Maybe it's a distribution agreement. Maybe you want to appoint an agent. So understand the different options in each of the markets that you're considering, and then choose the one that is most appropriate to you and your business. Now, once you've settled on a market, so you've done the basic research and you've chosen the market that you think is the one or the ones in which you would like to expand, manage your risk. Just as in any overseas venture, you need to consider all the possibilities and you need to develop a sound risk mitigation strategy for all of those risks. You also need to be patient when it comes to building your business. In Africa, you will need to foster and build relationships over a period of time. There are no quick fixes. You can't jump in, make some money and jump out. If you're going to be successful in the African market, you need to be in it for the long haul. Also understand that it's probably going to take longer than you imagined. If you're going to be established and then successful, and you're going to have one following the other naturally, you are going to have to put in the long yards, and that means you're going to have to take the time. And you also have to be flexible. You have to improvise on the hoof sometimes, and you need to be very flexible in your approach. If you are rigid and you want to stick to certain things, only those things, you are probably going to struggle. You need to be flexible and you need to listen to the feedback that you are getting from your customers and also from other people on the ground. And that means you need to understand your customer. Irrespective of the markets in which you are active, irrespective of whether those markets are English-speaking markets, French-speaking markets, Portuguese-speaking markets, and anything in between, understand your customers, understand their Africanness, but also understand the country in which you are attempting to do business. If you stick with the right business model and you understand and are flexible and are responsive to your customers, you will do well. It's also important for you to plan to have really good people on the ground. The continent is far from Australia. If you cannot be there yourself, you need to rely on people on the ground, and you need to rely on local people who can guide you as much as possible. So if we look at Africa, we can see at a glance where the mining activity occurs, and you can certainly have a look at that in your own time. I'm sure we'll make the deck available to you. Mining at a glance in Africa. So buried beneath the surface of Africa, as we all know, is a wealth of hugely valuable and extractable natural resources. Mining is one of the most important industries in Africa, and the mining sector in Africa is one of the largest in the world. It's a major producer of many key minerals and commodities, and that includes metals and minerals like gold, diamond, cobalt, bauxite, iron ore, coal, copper, and any number of others. Some of the major mining countries are the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the DRC, South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. But as you saw from the map, any number of others have mining activities too. The African mining exploration budget in 2019 was $1.1 billion US, and the country with the largest mining exploration budget was the DRC. Critical mineral production: cobalt, 120,000 megatons, and refined cobalt, 4,916 megatons. The leading mining company based on market cap in 2020, Anglo American Platinum, and based on revenue in 2021, Anglo American. If we look at the projected value of mining and infrastructure projects in Africa, you can see the figures for yourself. Energy and power is by far the largest, but even if we look at mining, which is a little bit further down the scale, it is still a substantial amount of money that we're talking about. And if we look at the number of mining and infrastructure projects in Africa, again, we can see that energy and power, and again, that is simply because the country needs to build a lot of infrastructure in order to get to where it needs to be. Energy and power leads the road, but mining comes in third at the projected number of mining and infrastructure projects for this year. If we look at mining at a glance, we can see how Africa compares to the rest of the world, and you can see that it tracks really well in terms of the development of projects and where they sit in terms of the rest of the world. So Africa certainly has some huge opportunities for Australian METS companies. A number of Australian companies are already active in the continent. This, of course, is a pathway to market. But it is important to understand that there are challenges and opportunities in almost equal measure on the continent, and you need to approach it the right way. If you do it right and you're in it for the long haul, you will do very well, but you cannot rush at it and you cannot rush it. So bear that in mind when you think about Africa as a potential for you. And of course, the African Continental Free Trade Area is also going to go a long way towards making it easier to do business from one African country to another. So if we look at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement at a glance, we can see that it is the world's largest free trade area. It brings together 55 countries of the African Union, 8 regional economic communities. It is expected to boost Africa's income by $450 billion by 2035, and it is focused on creating a single African market through implementing a protocol on trade in goods and competition. It is also trying to simplify the movement of people from one country to another. It simplifies and harmonizes customs laws and procedures, so it will be a lot easier to move goods across borders. And it is also aimed at preventing transshipment and ensuring customs cooperations, amongst others. The African Free Trade Area will progressively eliminate tariffs on intra-African trade. So if you set up in one African country and you want to trade with another, it will make it easier for African businesses to trade within the continent, and also a lot more efficient. and a lot more lucrative too. So the African Continental Free Trade Area is something that is going to make it easier for Australian METS businesses to enter the continent and to do business from one country to another within the continent, as opposed to just from Australia into Africa. And on that note, we are now going to hear from somebody who is actually doing it, who's going to share some of his challenges and opportunities and also some of his observations of doing business in the market. And I am delighted to now hand the virtual floor to you, Linton.
Thank you very much, Collins, and thank you, Grant. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity to speak. As Colin said, I'm currently in Zambia. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning right now. So yeah, excited to speak to you guys. Grant's introduced me at the start of the webinar, so I'll probably just get into it. So what I did for this presentation, I thought it might be beneficial to do a pestle analysis, so a situational analysis on the two countries that we're operating out of. I'm originally from Zimbabwe, so I understand how I understand the environment, I understand the dynamics of the environment and the people, and Zambia is a neighboring country that I understand as well. So in Zambia, we're currently facilitating the trade of precious metals and also non-ferrous metals between buyers in Europe, in the Middle East and in Asia, and suppliers in Africa. So in terms of Zambia, just a quick pestle analysis. So Zambia, actually 8 months ago, they recently had elections and they've got a new president. His name is Hakainde Hichilema. So he's a very interesting character. And he's basically shaping the political landscape in Zambia at the moment. He doesn't take a salary, as the president. He doesn't even live in the state house, and he's trying to clean up the politics in Zambia. So Zambia is a relatively safe state. I've been here for 3 weeks, and I felt extremely safe. It's a democratic state. There's freedom of speech. You're welcome to speak freely about your political views, and the political dynamics are quite predictable. There's no evidence, or there's no threat of coups or any wars, regardless of what's happening in neighboring countries. There's this new political regime is bringing about some changes within Zambia itself. They're setting up new ministries. One that I heard about, that I was told about, is a new ministry for small scale entrepreneurs, and they're basically wanting to promote business ownership and free enterprise, as opposed to people working in jobs. I think they see a lot of opportunity there because Zambia is very rich in resources. You'll obviously have, threats in the political sphere. They've got their own internal political dynamics where there's infighting, but that doesn't really affect business. It might really affect any foreign investment, and like everywhere, you're going to find corruption. And from what I'm hearing on the ground here, this current president is looking to sort of clean up things, where there's no bribery and everybody's accountable. There's proper processes, but he's only been in power for 8 months, so there's a fair bit of work for him to do. In terms of the economic opportunities, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity in mining, because it's very much underdeveloped. The mining sector. I think there's a lot of opportunities for people to come in, particularly people in the MET sector. They're very outdated mining practices in Zambia, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to bring in new technologies, to bring in new mining practices, particularly if you're coming from Australia that has a very rich mining culture. there's risk in terms of the economic threats. There's lack of capital. There's just in the private sector, there's not a lot of money. There's not a lot of investment in mining and agriculture. So I think the industry is still in its infancy, which in my opinion, I think there's a lot of potential for growth there. So the lack of capital and liquidity, I think, are threats in the economic sphere. Manufacturing as well, there's a lot of opportunity there. So 90% of what Zambia consumes, they import. So I think there's if you're in the manufacturing sphere, I think there's an opportunity for you to come into the country as well. From a social perspective, there's 22 million, so it's about population-wise, it's about the size of Australia, but obviously not as big. English is the official language, and when I was sort of deciding to come into Zambia, that for me that was an important factor, because communication, it just makes business easier. The people in Zambia, even if they haven't gone to school, they can speak English. The security guard at the hotel that I'm staying at, they can speak English very well, so you can communicate with everybody. The country's very safe. Like I said, I've been here for 3 weeks. I haven't been scammed. I haven't lost anything. Nothing's been stolen. So I think, and everybody's just so nice. They're just such a polite people. So from a social perspective, I think if you're, looking, it's not, like, I don't know if you guys have heard about some of the countries up in North Africa, they might have a few of those issues. Some of the threats from a social perspective, from what I've heard on the ground, directly from people, I conducted interviews to gather information for this presentation. There is a fair bit of Chinese exploitation. There's a feeling that China wants to, there's a colonization approach, for lack of a better phrase, because of the vast mineral resources, particularly in the copper belt. China is very interested in copper, and due to the lack of liquidity and the lack of capital, the Chinese are coming in with money, with cash, and that's, yeah. So I think there's a few sociological issues that are arising from that approach, particularly in the Patauka province. There's a lot of Chinese activity, and from what the locals are saying, exploitation. And in speaking about that, I think there's a lot of opportunity here for Australia to come in, because I think Zambia and even Zimbabwe, we're very closely aligned, like Collins mentioned, culturally aligned as well with Zambia, and I think there's an opportunity for Australian businesses to come in the right way and do business. I think they're looking for implementation partners. They're not looking for people who are going to sort of come in, make money and leave. They're looking for mutually beneficial relationships where there's a mutual exchange of information, of goods, of knowledge. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Zambia is also one of those countries that has a very, very young population. So you'll find that, you'll find social issues like HIV, 50 to 70 young people every week are being affected. And that's because, there's a fair bit of poverty here as well, which means there's not much sexual education. So like most African countries, you'll find that they're dealing with that sort of thing. In terms of technology, because it's very underdeveloped, I think there's a lot of opportunity for infrastructure development to partner up with the Zambian government, even with other businesses as well, to bring in technologies from Australia, to try and I guess to develop some of these underdeveloped assets. The Zambian government are pushing for green jobs, so there's very much everybody is aware of the green economy, but I think there needs to be a lot more push. There needs to be a lot more capital invested into that area. So I think there's opportunity there. The threats is, lack of equipment. There's still very outdated mining practices. People are still using shovels. You might have a front loader here and there, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for people to bring in equipment, because what that'll do is that'll increase efficiencies, reduce waste, and obviously increase productivity. The environment, the climate is very mild. It's not freezing, and it's not very, very hot. It's in the middle of winter, but I've barely worn a jumper. And I think from the research that I've done and moving around and so forth, in the northwestern province of Zambia has a lot of opportunities in terms of copper mining, and that is my area of interest. And that's essentially why we're here. I think there's vast untapped potential for mineral exploration in Zambia. There's a lot of opportunity there. The government they're also trying to form new government bodies. For example, there's a newly formed Zambian Environmental Management Agency, which sort of make sure that any mining practices are considering the environment, which is where our interest in ESG comes in, and we can once we start actually mining and extracting and so forth, we want to implement those practices. And a very big threat to the environment is artisanal mining. So these are people with picks and shovels. There's not a lot of safe mining practices. And again, I see that as an opportunity for people to come in who have the know-how to actually train and show people that basically just to train people on safe mining practices. And in Zambia, the law works, so if there's any legal advice that you might need, which is what we've done, that's very available here in Zambia. So Collins, if you can go to the next slide. So I just thought I'd talk about what we're doing on the commodity side. So Renstar, so we're currently so we facilitate the sale of precious metals, particularly in this case we're doing we're brokering essentially the sale of precious metals between buyers in the Middle East and Zambia. And what we did was we developed a risk assessment framework just to limit the risk of misrepresentation. So before I came to Zambia, I did a so it's the stage that I call the lead qualifier stage. So it's a desktop risk assessment where I get all the documentation to make sure that it meets the buyer's criteria, the product that's on offer, and then I conduct a more in-depth due diligence. And this involves initially sending somebody to go on site to actually make sure that the commodity is there, to inspect it and to take photos and to send it to me to get assay reports and so forth. And then at this point, this is when I come on site, which is what I've done now, and I conduct a supply chain audit. So essentially, I go on the ground. I conduct the testing with one of the agencies. I'm present for the smelting. We verify all the documentation through the Ministry of Mines to make sure that all the taxes have been paid, and all the relevant sort of like the proof of ownership, the certificate of origin. We make sure that we have all those documentations before export. Liaise with, like I said, with the Ministry of Mines, with the customs and immigrations agencies, and also the logistics companies prior to export. So essentially what you have to do in Zambia, in my line of work, is you have to take a risk-based approach. You have to assume that any documentation you're getting is false, essentially, until you're on the ground and you can verify its legitimacy. It's the only way that doing business in my line of work will. I mean, there's a guy who came to me in Australia, and he was doing business in Kenya, I believe, and he lost $4.5 million in misrepresentation, and he was trying to do all of this remotely. And as Collins mentioned earlier on, if you're going to be successful in Africa, you have to be on the ground. You have to take the time out to go on the ground, build relationships with local agencies. You've got to figure out, as Colin said, how are you going to enter that market? So in our case, we're currently just we're here just as facilitators, but as we progress, we will actually set up, and we have the opportunity to set up as a foreign-owned business. But we'll also do, when we start mining, we've got an opportunity for a joint venture as well. So being on the ground has helped me really understand the market, talking to people, talking to local agencies. And I think it would be, if you're looking to come into Zambia, that is it's a worthwhile exercise. And in this commodity trade as well, I'll then also do a risk assessment on the buyer side and their refineries and their foundries and so forth. Because as much as there's misrepresentation on the seller side, there's also misrepresentation on the buyer side. We want to make sure that the buyers have got enough money to purchase these commodities. We get proof of funds, we get verifiable bank confirmation letters from their bank managers to make sure that they've got money. Yeah, awesome. If you can go on the next slide, Collins, as well. And some of the gaps that I've identified in Zambia, from an economic perspective, as I mentioned before, I think there's a very underdeveloped manufacturing sector. I think there's an opportunity for high value exports like copper cathodes or any finished products that come out of minerals, essentially. Processing plants. So if you're a business that sells machinery and processing plants, there's a lot of opportunity in Zambia here. Possibly, I think, approaching the government or partnering up with local businesses. I think if you sort of went in that route, you could do very well. As I said, I think Australia is a lot more aligned to Zambia and even Zimbabwe than the Chinese are, and I think there's an opportunity in Zambia for Australian businesses. From a social perspective, there's a lack of education. A friend of mine who lives here actually told me that when he first moved to Zambia, some of the year 7s were at a year 3 reading level. So I think in terms of education and training programs and apprenticeship programs, if any of your businesses offer those services, there's a lot of opportunity for training programs, because that's essentially going to empower. It's going to empower local content, and I'll go into more of that when I talk about Zimbabwe. There's a need for new machinery, and also an opportunity for ESG and sustainable development programs and sustainable mining practices. Perfect. And this is a pestle analysis on Zimbabwe. So I'm from Zimbabwe. I was born in Zimbabwe. And we actually set up a mining company in Zimbabwe because we saw an opportunity to mine copper, but we wanted to do it differently. We didn't want to just go and extract, and I can talk about that a little bit later. But Zimbabwe is, they've also, there's been a change in leadership as well. In Zimbabwe, it's known as the Second Republic. And this Second Republic, through President Mnangagwa, is trying to re-engage with the world. So if you recall, in the Mugabe regime, there was a lot of restrictions. There were trade embargoes and so forth. But Mnangagwa and the Second Republic are wanting to to re-engage with the world, and basically to let the world know that Zimbabwe is open to re-engaging and open for business. So from a political perspective, they're trying to make business easier for investors. There's a newly formed ZEDA, so it's the Zimbabwe Investment Development Authority. So essentially, before, when investors wanted to come into Zimbabwe, you had to go to 100 different places to apply for this license, to go to the Reserve Bank and so forth. But ZEDA is essentially a one-stop shop. So if you go in there wanting to invest in Zimbabwe or wanting to do business in Zimbabwe, you literally go to one office and they process all your licenses and application and documentation. So they're trying to streamline basically the processes and make things easier for people to do business in Zimbabwe. There's obviously threats, like a lot of African countries. You'll find that there's state participation. So if you're in the minerals trade, you've got MMCZ that basically controls the mineral exports out of Zimbabwe. The bureaucracy, obviously, corruption is usually it's a threat. It's everywhere in Africa, but it's just how you navigate it. That's what makes the difference, essentially. From an economic perspective, the new government are trying to encourage people to come and mine in Zimbabwe. So, for example, like for my company, because we're in the mining sector, you get a tax holiday from year 1 to 5. So that enables you to reinvest into your project and into the company, which we found was very attractive. There's a lot of opportunity. I mean, Zimbabwe, 72% of the country is under mineral wealth. So you'll find that, there's a few companies, multinational companies that are going in to explore. I know Invictus Energy is an Australian company, and they're currently drilling for oil in Zimbabwe. So, I mean, if an Australian's going in there to prospect and so forth, I think there's a lot happening there. But I would suggest that if you're wanting to look at Zimbabwe, go to Zimbabwe, visit it, because you'll find that what you see on the media and what you see on social media, for example, is not always the case on the ground. When you talk to locals, go around and see different places, you'll find that the situation is a little bit different. There's obviously threats because the banking and financial environment is not very stable, because obviously the trade embargoes sort of destabilized the economy. The inflation went through the roof, so you'll find that it's not as established. So there's always risk associated with unestablished financial systems. From a social perspective, Zimbabwe is again, it's an English-speaking country. It's a former British colony, so everybody can speak English. You can communicate quite easily there. I think there's an opportunity for triple bottom line mining, or ESG mining, training programs. There's an underdeveloped health system there. So if you provide any services or equipment or machinery in the health space, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And believe it or not, Zimbabwe is a really peaceful country. You find that what people go through politically is not really what's going on, amongst the local people. Zimbabweans are very peaceful. They're not really they're not going to want to come and rob you. They're welcoming. So I would see, if you're wanting to visit Zimbabwe, I would most definitely encourage it. If you're wanting to do business there, visit the place first, so you can work out your entry strategy. From a technological perspective, there is a lot of opportunity. I know I just saw on the president's social media the other day that they've invested $300 million in a new lithium mine. And their slogan was greener jobs for Zimbabwe. So this ESG, I guess, mentality is also there. You know, I think they see a lot of opportunity in the green economy. I know they bought a lot of machinery, hundreds of front loaders and bulldozers and so forth. So the government is investing in this space. So if again, if you have mining equipment, or if it's mining services, it's definitely worthwhile considering, because Zimbabwe is like I said, has a lot of mineral wealth. In terms of threats from a technological perspective, there's no, for example, there's no refineries. So all the exports are basically raw materials, and there's not a lot of finished high value exports that are going out. So if you offer any of these services, or if you build plants, there's a real opportunity to go in there and I guess provide your equipment or services. From an environmental perspective, Zimbabwe is pretty much like Zambia. You know, they're very mild climates. Although in recent years, you know, they experienced a lot of floods. Climate change is very real there. So this is why they're sort of acknowledging that, you know, I think we need to look at how can we look after the environment, but also realize our economic potential. You know, my dad is a farmer in Zimbabwe, and he was just telling me a couple of days ago that a lot of the farmers can't rely on rain any longer. Or you know, you can't harvest your crops, so they've got to rely on irrigation, and sometimes that costs money. So again, there's a lot of opportunity there as well. In terms of from a legal perspective, one thing that I've noticed that's really changed from the Mugabe regime till now is that now there's actually freedom of speech. Before, when Mugabe was in power, you couldn't say anything negative about the president or the government, because they'd pretty much lock you up. But now it is very different. People are free to express their opinions, and you know, and you find that in social media, you find that in the local newspapers. People criticize the president where they think he's not delivering. So I think that's a noteworthy change. So yeah, that's that from a legal perspective. And Collins, if you can go to the next slide. So in Zimbabwe, I'll go through the gaps. So there's limited foreign currency because of the underdeveloped banking system in Zimbabwe. You'll find that there's no access to financing, and I guess that's why there isn't, you know, you don't have you know, manufacturing facilities. You don't have people there's no refineries and so forth, because there's just from a private sector perspective, there's not a lot of money to set up that infrastructure. So if anybody provides funding services, I think there's a lot of opportunity. Obviously, you have to do your due diligence because there'd be a lot of risk involved. But as we all know, where there's a lot of risk, there's potentially also a lot of reward. So if you're in that space as well, that's an area I'd strongly consider. If you offer educational services, you know, for example, you know, training programs, apprenticeships, I think there's a lot of opportunity there as well. Sustainable mining practices, where you're training people how to mine, you know, with the consideration of the environment and from a social perspective, I think there's opportunity there. I've spoken about technology, being in the METS sector. If you sell equipment, mining plants, definitely a lot of there's a lot of opportunity there because Zimbabwe is looking to grow its economy through the MET sector. And also, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's from a technological perspective. So if you're selling mining equipment, plants, there's a lot of opportunity there. And then I'll go on to what we're doing, onto the next slide, Collins, on what we're doing in Zimbabwe. So our approach in Zimbabwe is we are wanting to set up a green mining model of excellence. So we're not wanting to just go in there, extract copper and leave, but we're looking at an empowerment model where we're using the ESG approach to extracting copper, but also empowering the community. You know, we want to use eco water solutions. We're partnering up with an Israeli company. They're also based in Australia, where it's essentially a mechanism that extracts water from oxygen. So there's no pipes, there's no plumbing that's required. So it doesn't interfere with the water table. It's an incredible piece of equipment. So these are some of the things that we're looking to apply on site in our mining projects. And essentially our commodities business has been set up to fund this. So we're going to start very, very small and then scale up from there. So rather than exploiting the local, we want to empower local content. So we'll be extracting fair trade copper. So we'll be paying above market rates to the locals. We're going to hire local. We'll pay them above market rates. As we know, in Africa, labor is very cheap, and we don't want to exploit the locals. Essentially, we want to empower them. We want to train people so that even after our mining operations end, they can still sustain themselves. You know, so we're implementing a lot of those practices, a lot of those philosophies within our mining model of excellence. We're going to partner up with the environmental impact agency, and they're going to assist us to make sure that we're everything that we're doing is above board, and that it is an ESG approach. Yeah, that's pretty much what we're doing in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linton. That was great. Grant, I think you'll come on board again now, and we'll all stay on board and see if we've got any questions. I might just raise one that's already been posted, and Linton, I'll throw this one to you, and then I'll put my 2 cents worth as well. Question to you: how long do you think it will be before you are fully operational? And once you've answered that one, we'll move on to the next part of that same question.
Yep, so fully operational in Zimbabwe, I would say between 18 to 24 months is how long it would take. That's how long it'll take for us to be fully operational. But we're starting very, very small. We're not, we're not taking the Fortescue approach where you're investing, $2 billion into it. No, not at all. We're going to start very, very small, and then we're going to scale up from there. But there's a lot of work, obviously, that goes into that. You've got to do drilling. You've got to do, the JORC assessments. You've got to have a mining plan. Yeah, so essentially between 18 and 24 months, we'll be fully operational.
Great. And then the second part of this question, as specifically relates to Zimbabwe and Zambia, and then I'll look at it more broadly. What is the preferred model in both of those countries? Some form of JV or wholly owned foreign company?
Very, very good question. So in Zambia, you can. So we're going to go in. We're going to go into a joint venture agreement with a gentleman. He owns about 13 mines. So we're taking a risk-based approach. We're going to first do the JOIV entry strategy, and then we're going to be a solely owned foreign entity. And there's a way that you can do that. You can open up a company as a foreign entity. I think you need to have $250,000 in your bank account that you own, but they just want to see that you're going to invest in the company, in the country, sorry, and you can actually operate as a solely owned foreign entity without any restrictions at all. In Zimbabwe, because I'm from there, I'm operating as a local. Yeah.
Great. And Jolene, I think in terms of the rest of the continent, it really does depend on the country. Some countries have very strict rules around foreign ownership and the percentage of ownership that has to be in local hands. So it really does depend on the individual market as to what the right method of incorporation is going to be for you. And in terms of how long it's going to take to get established in some of the other markets, well, it depends entirely on what you do. In terms of how long it takes to actually register the business, the World Bank publishes a really comprehensive list of stats based on all sorts of data that they collect that will tell you exactly how long it takes to register the business. But of course, that's just the very beginning of actually being successful in a market. There's another question, Linton. Training platform is offered by this company, representative in South Africa, reached out to LinkedIn. I think that's one that we'll take offline, Sue and Lawrence, because it's probably more of a business exploration one, that one. So we'll make sure, Linton, that we capture this particular question for you, and we'll get it to you after the fact. So I think that one is best done that way. Any other questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box.
And just to answer your question about how long does it take to, I think you mentioned something about how long it takes to open up a company. In Zambia, it takes about 4 weeks. So if you've got all your documentation, if you have, for example, that $250,000, it takes about 4 weeks from when. So I'm using a lawyer to do all of this. I think I feel a lot more comfortable rather than agents and so forth. You'd rather go through a reputable lawyer who I've done due diligence on. So it takes a month in Zambia, and you're fully operational with your license as well.
And I think you'll probably find that that's fairly accurate across the continent. Grant, just before you jump in, just to reiterate what Linton said about using legal representation, and if you work with a lawyer that also has offices here and in the other country,
yes,
then you've solved a number of issues from a due diligence perspective. But spend the legal dues up front. And you avoid the pain of not having spent them up front further down the track. So.
That's correct. That's correct.
Just one from me. I was listening to you on the ESG. So is that becoming something that's becoming more preferred within both the countries that you're targeting at the moment, and also more general? Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. It is becoming, people are very aware of the ESG approach here, but there's just no infrastructure. If the infrastructure and investment was there, I think people would definitely, there'd be a massive uptake. I mean, in Zambia, I've only seen one electric car, and just speaking to a lot of people, and they're probably very well off. But speaking to a lot of people, they want electric cars, they want these sorts of things, but there's just no infrastructure for it. The appetite's there, but there's no infrastructure.
And I think we'll find that as more and more people, both upstream and downstream of the operations in African countries, are requiring them to prove that they comply with ESG standards, everything else will catch up, because it will have to. So there's a huge amount of opportunity there, I think, for Australia to play a role, and Australian companies, particularly on the infrastructure front. I mean, you can't have, for example, electrical vehicles if you don't have electricity.
That's correct. Exactly.
You can push it, but you can't do much else with that vehicle. And in a country like South Africa, where the electricity supply is really unreliable and load shedding is a major problem, people would love to have their electric cars, but they can't. But in terms of corporate governance, I think ESG it's a fact of life, and there's a role to play absolutely for us as Australians, and also for an organisation like Austmine, who is doing a lot of work in that space. So, you know, really interesting times I think we find ourselves in. Doesn't look as if there are any other questions. If there are, please feel free to type them in the chat box. And maybe while that is occurring, Grant, I'm going to throw back to you, and you can officially do your closing. And if there are any other questions, we'll just slot them in immediately after that.
Beautiful. Thank you, Collins. Thank you, Linton. That was a fantastic webinar. I know I got a lot about it. We've been communicating with Linton since late last year, and it's been fantastic to actually put it together, considering, Linton, that you are in country at the moment, and there's been, last time we spoke to Linton, it was actually the safari park. We were waiting for a lion to walk in the background, but no, it didn't happen. Unfortunately, that would have really given us a bit more impetus. So thank you again, Linton. I know I got a lot of it, and thank you as well, Collins. So our Victorian Export Hub is starting to kick into gear again with the new financial year, with a series of webinars for our hub members. So don't forget, the hub is free to join, and we'd encourage you to do so if you're interested in doing so. We've got a particularly important 3-part webinar series coming up on cybersecurity, starting on the 5th of July, with 2 follow-up webinars on the 19th and the 19th of July, and then on the 2nd of August. If you have any questions about cybersecurity, I know it's a term that gets thrown around quite loosely, but you should attend these sessions, as these webinars are designed to be clear and accessible to all METS businesses, regardless of size and technical expertise. I'm sure we've all got a story about someone being hacked because they pressed on the wrong link, or something similar to that happened. So these are focused on creating an awareness of key cybersecurity issues and fostering a culture of cyber readiness within each participating organisation, all while assisting participants with formulating practical policies and incident response plans. Now, that all sounds a bit wordy, rather complicated, but I know the person who's going to be presenting this, and that's Australia's first Cyber Readiness Institute certified readiness coach and Victorian Expert Hub lead, Collins Rex. So I'm sure Collins will be able to simplify it for even the most ICT challenged person. So we're presenting other webinars as well as our, which is part of our ongoing capability accelerator program, which you'll be invited to as members of the Victorian METS Export Hub. If you don't get an invite from the hub, please check our website or our LinkedIn for further information. We're always posting up information on there. You get some more value out of the Export Hub. We've also got a number of upcoming Austmine events, with a webinar next week on our Aeromet Safety First Innovation Challenge. Then on 31st of August, we're actually doing a smart mining event here in Victoria. And then later in the year, a CEO lunch with Matt Gill from White Rock. So these are just a few of the events that are upcoming for Austmine members. Don't forget, Austmine's conference is in Adelaide from 9th to 11th of May next year. And also, let's not forget IMARC, which has been moved to Sydney, and the dates are now the 2nd to the 4th of November. Remember, these, as well as other events, will be listed on our website as soon as they come up. Generally speaking, if you ring me and ask me about an event, I'm going to look at the website. So it's always a good place to start there and cut me out as the middleman, so to speak, but I'm always happy to take the call anyway. So thank you again to Linton. Thank you again to Collins. Collins' sessions on cybersecurity will be one to attend, as will the other sessions that we're running as part of that accelerator program too. So thank you very much for joining. Thank you, Linton, again. It's been great having that. Thank you, Collins. I wish you all a good day and all the best. Cheerio.
Thank you, Grant. Everyone. Thank you, Collins. Thank you, everyone. Thank you kindly.
And
thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.